Good day, and today we're going to look at an introduction to Mary Shelley and her novel Frankenstein. Now, her model of the story is from the modern Prometheus. So let's talk a little bit about the context of Frankenstein by looking at Prometheus. Now, in Greek mythology, Prometheus was a titan who created man in the image of the gods. He also stole the gift of fire from Mount Olympus and gave it to man. Now, because he did that, he was punished by the god Zeus and chained to a rock on a mountain. Now, every day for 30 years, Zeus's eagle would come and eat his liver out. So when we base our knowledge of Prometheus into what our story of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein might be, what predictions can we make about the novel? So we can see that Prometheus is a titan who's creating man in the image of the gods. You're trying to create the perfect human being. I'm wondering if I'm going to see that happening in our story of Frankenstein. He also stole the gift of fire from Mount Olympus and gave it to man. I'm wondering if there's going to be a fire that's going to be a major plotline reference. And because he's been doing these things to help man, he's going to get punished by the god Zeus, chained to a rock on a mountain. And every day for 30 years, Zeus's eagle would eat his liver. I'm not sure that that exact part of the story is going to show up, but I'm wondering if there is going to be a punishment for creating a perfect man. Now let's look at the author herself. Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley was the daughter of two of England's leading intellectual radicals. Her father, William Godwin, was an influential political philosopher and novelist. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was the author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. She was a pioneer in promoting women's rights and education. Now, her future husband, the admired poet Percy B. Shelley, was one of her father's frequent visitors. Now, when she was 16, she and Percy eloped to France. She gave birth to 4 of his children in 5 years, 3 of whom died as infants, and it was rumored that her children were in mind when creating Frankenstein. Her husband Percy also died 8 years later due to a boating accident, so Shelley received a lot of tragedy in a short period of time. So in the summer of 1816, we have a 19-year-old Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin and her lover, the poet Percy Shelley, visiting the Lord Byron at his villa beside Lake Geneva in Switzerland. Now, here is where the motivation for the story of Frankenstein possibly comes in. Stormy weather frequently forced them indoors, where they and Byron's other guests sometimes read from a volume of ghost stories. One evening, Byron challenged his guests each to write one themselves. Mary's story, inspired by a dream, became Frankenstein. For days, Shelley couldn't think of an idea, but then heard Lord Byron and Percy discussing the probability of using electricity to create life artificially, according to a theory called galvanism. An idea then began to grow in her mind. The next day, Shelley started work on Frankenstein, and a year later, she had completed her novel. It was published in 1818 when Shelley was 19 years old. Now, we also have to remember that she had a few daughters and sons that died in infancy. For example, her daughter Clara had died in infancy. And she had dreamed that her daughter was brought back to life through vigorous rubbing and being held near a warm fire. Part of this is what inspired her to write Frankenstein. Now, this particular story was not intended to be a tale of the supernatural. Shelley even made her main character a scientist, so that his building of man would seem logical. Perhaps then this was a combination of the Gothic romantic movements and the elements of science. So perhaps then we might want to consider Frankenstein to be a very early science fiction novel. We also know that Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley was also going to be influenced by the educational theories of the 1800s. For example, nature versus nurture. When looking into John Locke's essay concerning human understanding from 1690, he argued that a child is a blank slate, a tabula rasa, that is formed only through experience and nurturing. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Emile, or On Education of 1762, however, promotes the idea that a child's upbringing is responsible for his nature. Now, when we look at the historical events leading up to the writing of Frankenstein, in 1789 we have the start of the French Revolution. The British were happy that the French were trying to rid themselves of an absolute monarchy, and common people were standing up for themselves. They, however, became disillusioned with bloodshed and the common leaders who turned to tyrants themselves. So by 1793 and 1794, you now see the French Reign of Terror, where common people were just going around and creating chaos. By 1804, Napoleon is crowned emperor, and he starts his tangent of going across Europe and conquering most countries. Now let's look at the literary movement around the time of Shelley's Frankenstein. We are in Romantic movement, the Romanticism movement, which was from about 1798 to 1865 in Europe. This movement is contrary to Enlightenment and industrialization, which emphasizes how man's reason and logic can improve society through science and reason. Instead, Romanticism emphasizes the importance of the individual, subjectivity, imagination, and expression of emotions. Now, during this time of bloodshed and turmoil, Romantic writers were turning to nature as an escape from the harsh realities of the world. Nature was a place where human tyrannies did not exist or reign. Now, during the Romantic period, a journey to find oneself through nature, isolation, and meditation was done as a romantic kind of quest. Now, natural science would lead to a discovery. So even though we are in the romantic idea of individualism and imagination, you're also going to see nature becoming important, and therefore natural science will lead to discoveries. Now, this quest could be a physical journey, but it could also be a mental journey, a psychological or a spiritual journey. Let's take a look at Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley's writing style. So we are considering Frankenstein to be a Gothic novel. In Frankenstein, Shelley adds a psychological component by delving into the psyches of the characters in an attempt to explain why they react as they do and what drives them to make their decisions. For example, your setting is usually in a castle. There's this atmosphere of mystery and suspense, not only surrounding the setting, but the first characters that you see. There seems to be an ancient prophecy tied to this setting and to the people who live there. Some of your characters are going to have omens that are brought up, or visions or portents. And throughout the story, they're going to have supernatural or otherwise inexplicable events happening. Other parts of your elements of the Gothic novel include the plot lines, such as you might be seeing your characters having high, even overblown or overwrought emotion, women in distress, and women threatened by a powerful, impulsive, or tyrannical male. You also have some elements of fiction where you have the metonymy of gloom and horror that pervades throughout everything, and certainly the vocabulary of the Gothic is going to set the psychological component of this doom and gloom, this negativity that just pervades throughout the entire novel. So what was science doing up to this point? We are in the Romantic movement, and we are looking at a Gothic novel, but there still is part of the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason behind this. Well, during Mary's time, scientists and physicians were fascinated by the elusive boundary between life and death. They experimented with lower organisms and performed human anatomical studies. They attempted to resuscitate drowning victims and performed experiments using electricity to restore life to the recently dead. Now, with the structure of the story, the novel is constructed in three concentric layers, one within the other. Now, when you read the actual letters, it feels like we're just getting letters back and forth between characters, but there's actually a story within a story. So let's look at the framework narrative. The outermost framework is going to be Robert Walton's letters to his sister. And so that's going to be kind of from Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley's point of view. So you can see that those letters are from chapters 1 to 4 in the prologue, chapter 24 in the epilogue. Your narrator is Robert Walton. Now, the middle of the story is Victor Frankenstein's story as he tells it to your first narrator, Robert Walton. So chapters 1 through 10 and chapters 17 through 24. And in the very innermost, the middle part of your novel, is the monster's description to Frankenstein of the development of his mind at the de Lacy's. So chapters 11 through 16, the narrator is the creature. So you kind of have this V structure of the story where you start off with Robert Walton, then you hear from Victor Frankenstein, then the creature tells his story, then back to Victor Frankenstein, and finally chapter 24 in the epilogue, you get back to Robert Walton. Now, you'll also see quite a few allusions in Frankenstein. Now, as a reminder, an allusion is an indirect reference to a person, place, thing, or idea that has historical, cultural, literary, or political significance. We've already talked about the first main allusion in Frankenstein, and that is the Greek myth of Prometheus, where gods made man out of clay in order to perfect them, and creation gave humans fire, and because of that, Prometheus is punished by the gods for helping out man. But we can also see a bit of John Milton's Paradise Lost. In Paradise Lost, when we have the creation of Adam and Eve, there's this lost place in the Garden of Eden by eating the forbidden fruit or being tempted by Satan. The extension of the story in the Bible, the book of Genesis, could also be considered an allusion here, where you're going to have this lost place where you can actually find new life, and then you find out it was all just a temptation, and in the end, it's a negative. We might also see a bit of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner as an allusion as well. As a reminder of what The Rime of the Ancient Mariner was, it's a poem about a sailor who kills an albatross and learns through spiritual and supernatural events to respect the sea, the natural world. However, he has a disregard for nature and tradition, which is going to lead to the sailor's demise. More allusions might be Cornelius Agrippa. Now, that was a German mystic and alchemist. He lived from about 1486 to 1535, and he's best known for his writings defending the hidden philosophy or magic. He also drew on diverse mystical traditions such as alchemy, astrology, and Kabbalah, and fused them together with scientific study. Perhaps you might see a bit of this in Victor Frankenstein. Once again, we'd also already looked at with the previous story, Adam and Eve, the biblical story where God creates Adam, gives him the Garden of Eden, and created Eve so Adam wouldn't be lonely. You might also notice the allusion of Paracelsus, which was a Swiss physician, alchemist, and astronomer of the German Renaissance. Again, maybe another hint at what Victor Frankenstein might be. He was a pioneer in the medical revolution of the time, and he felt the university did not teach all things. So Paracelsus sought out other mystical solutions to answer his questions. We might also be seeing a bit of Albertus Magnus, the German Catholic friar and bishop that was well known for his writings on philosophy and alchemy. He sometimes is referred to as a magician and said to have found a philosopher's stone. Lastly, let's look at the idea of the creature or monstrosity. The monster is only the most literal of a number of monstrous entities in the novel, including the knowledge that Victor used to create the monster. The fact that nobody else knows how he does it and how he can't explain it gives us that sense of foreboding. How does he know what he's doing? Now, one can argue that Victor himself is a kind of a monster, as his ambition, secrecy, and selfishness alienate him from human society. Now, ordinary on the outside, he may be the true monster inside, as he's eventually consumed by an obsessive hatred of his own creation. Finally, many critics have described the novel itself as a monstrous, stitched-together combination of different voices, texts, and tenses. After all, looking at all the different allusions and kind of knowing that Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley was pulling from her real-life tendencies towards depression, and basically was told that this was going to be a contest between writers to write their scariest story. A lot of critics look at this as a stitched-together combination of different voices and texts. So, hopefully now you're ready to read some of the first major science fiction novel, the book that establishes the genre of horror fiction. If you'd like me to actually go through some chapters of Frankenstein itself, whether you want me to summarize or look at analysis or look at characterization, please leave a comment down below. Let me know if you'd like me to continue on and actually get into the story of Frankenstein. And as always, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed. Take care.